Vincent Sallow walked out of Caruso Tower in handcuffs on a Tuesday morning, flanked by federal agents and followed by cameras. 24 hours earlier, he had been the most trusted man in Dante Caruso's organization. What dismantled him wasn't Dante's fist or a rival family's bullet. It was a manila folder, a spreadsheet, and a woman named Nora Castillo, who had every reason to stay quiet and chose not to. This is her story. Nora Castillo had worked for the Caruso organization for 6 years. She was 31, dark-haired, with a full, grounded presence that she carried the way she carried everything, without apology, without announcement. She ran the books for 3 of Dante Caruso's legitimate holding companies. Clean money, complicated origins, impeccable paperwork. She was the best at what she did, and she knew it. More importantly, so did Dante. But most people inside the organization didn't see Nora the way Dante did. They saw a quiet woman at a desk, someone whose name you learned only if you needed something from accounting. Vincent Sallow had worked alongside her for 4 of those 6 years and had spoken to her perhaps 40 words total, none of them kind. The incident happened on a Thursday in the main conference room on the 14th floor. Dante was running late. His senior staff waited. Vincent Sallow, 2 floor managers named Kowalski and Prete, and the firm's legal counsel, a dry man named Fisher who never looked up from his phone. Nora had been asked to present the quarterly reconciliation for the Meridian Holdings account. She set up her laptop, arranged her printed summaries in a row, and waited. When Vincent walked in and saw it was Nora presenting, he didn't sit down. He stood at the head of the table and surveyed the room with the particular expression of a man who has decided that diminishing someone is easier than respecting them. "They sent the bookkeeper," he said, not to her, to the room, as though she couldn't hear him from 4 feet away. "I was expecting someone from the senior team." Kowalski laughed. It was a short, accommodating sound, the kind that exists only to confirm that someone with more power has said something worth laughing at. Prete looked at the table. Fisher looked at his phone. Nora didn't move. She said, "I am the senior team for this account." Vincent picked up one of her printed summaries, turned it over once, and set it back down, as if it had failed to impress him. "Does Caruso know what he's paying for?" He gestured loosely at her papers, at the space she occupied, at all of it. "I've seen more professional presentations from the mailroom, and I've definitely seen more polished people giving them." He paused just long enough to make sure the room understood what he was implying. "Maybe next quarter we send someone who looks the part." The room went quiet, in the specific way rooms go quiet when something cruel has been said, and everyone present is quietly relieved it wasn't said about them. Kowalski's smile faded slowly, like something embarrassed by itself. Pret still didn't look up. Fisher put down his phone. Psychologists who study the aftermath of public humiliation, and Linda Hartling's research at the Stone Center remains the clearest framework, identify a consistent split in how targets respond. They either collapse inward, severing their connection to their own competence, or they demonstrate what Hartling calls moving with, a refusal to abandon their own self-regard under attack. The second response is rarer, and it requires something that no amount of preparation fully explains. It requires a person who already knows, without needing to be told, that their value is not located in the opinions of the person in front of them. Nora looked at Vincent Sallow. She didn't flush. She didn't gather her papers. She didn't leave. She said, in a voice so steady it had its own kind of authority, "The numbers are accurate, Vincent. I don't think you can say the same about your judgment." He opened his mouth to respond. The door opened. Dante Caruso walked in. Dante took in the room in under a second. He had been doing this his entire adult life. Reading a space the way other men read words, knowing instantly who was standing and who was sitting, what the air felt like before a word was spoken. He saw Nora at the head of the table with her laptop open and her posture completely still. He saw Vincent standing in the way that men stand when they have just done something they are privately satisfied with. He saw Kowalski's expression in the process of rearranging itself. He said nothing. He sat down. He nodded at Nora. She presented. Flawlessly. 40 minutes of quarterly reconciliation, variance analysis, and forward tax exposure projection, delivered with the precision of someone who had not just memorized the numbers, but understood the architecture beneath them. When she finished, Dante asked 3 questions. She answered all 3 without looking at her notes. Dante closed the meeting. As the room emptied, he paused beside her desk at the end of the table. He picked up one of her printed summaries and looked at it for a moment without speaking. "You're the only one who stays," he said, quietly, "not for anyone else. Everyone else in this building manages the mess." "You actually understand it?" Nora looked up at him. He was already walking out. She didn't know yet what he meant by staying. What she would find in the next 48 hours would change her understanding of everything she thought she knew about Caruso Tower. It was 2 days later, at 9:40 in the evening, that Nora found the file. She had stayed late, she almost always stayed late, working through a discrepancy in the Meridian Holdings ledger. It was small, $11,000 routed through a vendor called Axis Consulting Group. The vendor name was on the approved list. The billing code matched a standard service category. Everything looked correct at a surface level. But Nora had been doing this for 6 years, and the one discipline she had built into herself was this: the transactions that looked correct were the ones you looked at twice. Axis Consulting Group had been paid $11,000, but Nora had never processed a contract for Axis. She pulled the vendor file. The contract existed, dated 14 months ago, signed off by the operations department. She pulled the payment history. Axis had received 22 payments over 18 months. 11,000 here, 14,000 there, 9,000 in a third month. Irregular amounts, irregular intervals. Consistent enough to be a pattern, irregular enough to avoid flagging an automated threshold alert. The routing authorization on every single transaction carried Vincent Sallow's signature. She sat very still. She ran a reverse trace on the Axis Consulting Group tax ID. The company had been registered in Delaware 18 months ago. Its registered agent was a law firm that specialized in corporate formations for clients who required discretion. Its mailing address was a mailbox service in Midtown Manhattan. It had no website, no employees, no physical presence in any meaningful sense. Axis Consulting Group was a shell. Vincent Sallow had been pulling money from the Caruso accounts for a year and a half. Not enough to be visible in a surface audit, enough to matter. She ran the full exposure across all 3 holding companies she could access. Total, just over $400,000. That was only what she could see from where she was sitting. Nora closed her laptop. She sat in the dark office for 11 minutes. She counted, without meaning to, and thought clearly about what she was holding and what it meant. She could close the file. She had seen nothing. In practical terms, this was not a difficult calculation. Vincent Sallow was dangerous in the specific way that men feel entitled to loyalty are dangerous when they sense a threat. Nora had no protection in this building that wouldn't evaporate the moment it became inconvenient for someone. She had a desk and a salary and 6 years of impeccable work that exactly nobody would remember if she quietly disappeared from the payroll. She thought about Dante Caruso saying, "You're the only one who stays." She reopened her laptop. She spent the next 4 hours building a complete documentation package. Every transaction, every routing code, every shell company connection she could trace from where she sat. She organized it in 2 formats, one that a federal auditor would find intuitive, one that Dante Caruso, who understood money at its source rather than its surface, would absorb in under 10 minutes. She saved both copies to an encrypted drive she kept in her bag, cleared her session trail, and left the building at 1:47 in the morning. What she hadn't accounted for was that Vincent Salo had a contact in the building's server room, and that for the past 3 months he had been watching the Meridian Holdings ledger the same way a man watches a door he isn't entirely sure is locked. He knew she had found something. He didn't know how much, but he knew enough to move. The call came the next morning at 7:15, an unknown number, a man she had never spoken to, informing her in a pleasant and utterly neutral voice that she had left something at the office and that it would be returned to her personally at an address he named that afternoon. The address was not the office. Nora stood in her kitchen holding her phone and understood exactly what was happening. This is what Evan Stark identifies in his foundational work Coercive Control as the silencing maneuver. Never a direct threat, always framed as concern, as helpfulness, as a simple logistical arrangement. The threat lives entirely in the space between the words. You are expected to hear it and comply without ever being given the dignity of a refusal you could justify to yourself. She did not go to the address. She called Dante Caruso's assistant, said she needed 30 minutes, said it was financial, said it was urgent, said she would not send it over email. Dante called her back in 4 minutes. She told him she had found an irregularity. She told him she needed to show him in person. She told him she had received a call that morning she believed was connected. There was a pause on the line. Then, "Come now." She sat across from Dante in his private office on the 16th floor and laid out what she had found with the same precision she had used in the conference room days before. $400,000 minimum, 18 months of transactions, Vincent Salo's authorization on every routing slip, the shell company in Delaware, the call at 7:15 that morning. Dante didn't speak while she presented. He read. He turned pages. He looked at the routing codes for a long time. He went back to the beginning and read through the second format, her version for him, without looking up. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment that had weight to it. "Why didn't you close the file?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Because it was the right thing to do. And because you said I was the only one who stays." "Those are 2 different reasons." "They're the same reason," she said. He looked at her across the desk with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not gratitude, something more precise than that. Recognition. Nobody in that office understood yet, in that moment, the full consequence of what she had just set in motion. They would understand it by Tuesday. What happened next took 3 days and was quiet in the way that real power is always quiet. No scenes, no confrontations that could be prepared for. On the first day, Dante had his attorneys begin the process of tracing the Axis Consulting Group ownership chain and freezing its accessible accounts. On the second day, Vincent was asked to come in for what he was told was a routine review. On the third day, the federal contact Dante maintained at careful distance, a relationship that existed for exactly this kind of moment, received a complete documentation package. Vincent Salo walked into Caruso Tower on Tuesday morning, expecting a meeting. He walked out, in handcuffs, into cameras that had been tipped off the night before because Dante believed in proportional consequences, and Vincent had once stood in a conference room and told a room full of witnesses that Nora Castillo wasn't worth listening to. Public contempt deserved a public exit. John Gottman, who spent 4 decades studying what destroys both relationships and organizations, identified contempt as the single most corrosive force in any human dynamic. Not anger, not conflict, contempt. The belief that another person is beneath consideration. Vincent Sallow had looked at Nora Castillo for 4 years and seen nothing worth watching. He had stolen $400,000 and calculated that the greatest danger in the building was Dante. He never thought to watch the woman at the desk. That was his mistake. That was the precise and irreversible shape of it. That evening, Dante came to find Nora in her office. She was still there. It was 7 p.m., and she was finishing the Meridian Holdings reconciliation she had started 5 days ago, before all of this began, because the work still needed to be done, and she was the one who understood it. He sat down in the chair across from her desk, not the chair of a man who needed something, the chair of a man who had something to say, and was taking his time deciding how. "You could have kept your head down," he said. "Most people in this building would have." "Most people didn't build the documentation package first," she said. Something moved in his expression. "I've had people working for me for 20 years who would have closed that file without a second thought." "Then you've been carrying a lot on your own," she said. The room was quiet. The city outside the windows was doing what cities do, indifferent, ongoing, lit. "I'm restructuring financial oversight," he said finally. "I want you to head it. Not manage it, head it. Direct access to me, your own team. Authority over the accounts, not just the ledgers." Nora looked at him. She thought about 6 years of being the woman at the desk. She thought about a conference room and a dark office at 9:40 at night and 11 minutes of counting without meaning to. "I want approval authority on all routing authorizations above 5,000, she said. "Not review. Approval." "Done. In writing before Monday." He looked at her for a long moment. "Most people don't negotiate with me." "I know," she said. "That's been part of the problem." Attachment researchers, particularly the work of Cindy Hazan and Philip Shaver, who extended Bowlby's framework into adult bonds, identify a consistent marker of genuine connection. The moment a person stops managing how they are perceived by the other and simply becomes present with them. That evening, in a quiet office on the 14th floor, neither Dante Caruso nor Nora Castillo was managing anything. They were simply there, with the city outside and the paperwork between them and the specific, undefended weight of what they had just moved through together. Some things begin in a crisis. This was one of them. Dante stood. He paused at the door. "The only one who stays," he said again, quieter, like something he was only now finishing the thought on. She didn't answer. But she didn't look away. And that is the thing about the people in dangerous places who don't perform, and don't retreat, and don't ask to be seen. They are seen anyway, eventually, by the one person who knows how to look. Not because they demanded it, because they were simply, unmistakably, irreplaceably there. If this story stayed with you, a like is the most direct way to say so. And if you want to be there for the next person who refused to look away when it would have been easier, subscribe.